In this series of videos, we'll be talking about a type of business organization called a trust. Now, trusts are established in order to separate the ownership of an asset from legal rights to control it. In many cases, they're set up this way so that the people who are the beneficial owners of a particular asset can effectively be shielded from the desire to sell their assets off for necessarily short-term gain. Now, there are usually three parties involved in establishing such an institution. You have the trust's founder, the trustee, who oversees the conditions that have been imposed on the allocation and disbursement of assets, and you have the beneficiary, who is the person who ultimately receives the benefits of this particular organization. Now, the founder is the one who, of course, provides assets, but also the one that sets conditions for the trustee to use the assets for the benefit of or disbursement to the beneficiary. Now, interestingly, trusts are organized as a pass-through institution for tax purposes. They're not taxed on themselves. Rather, all of the income is taxed at the beneficiary level, such that a trust is effectively a pass-through, simply moving benefits to some particular party rather than being taxed itself. Now, a trust can be either temporary or perpetual in nature, but usually includes some kinds of instructions about how long apart it's supposed to endure for and exactly what it's supposed to be used for and by who. Now, in order to make sure that these types of institutions are properly administered, we usually have what are called trust companies that act as the trustee on behalf of the founder for the beneficiary. And this can facilitate management of a trust through superior product knowledge and access to legal departments that are available at larger scale organizations. Historically speaking, long-lived trusts were responsible for a majority of mortgage lending in Canada, the United States, and in Europe, largely because of their long-term horizons and the lack of liquidity needs in their portfolios. Now, in Canada, even though this distinction used to be particularly important, with the majority of mortgages being made by trust companies instead of banks, during our little bang in the 1980s, which led to the deregulation of the financial industry, we saw the distinctions between banks and trusts largely erode, and most of the major players in the financial sector acquired a trust organization in order to diversify their assets into more long-term portfolios as opposed to simply short-term ones. Now, complicating all of these types of vehicles are the notion of certain kinds of trusts being restricted by their founders as to where it is that they're necessarily domiciled, or how the assets can be used effectively for external leverage. So one of the most common terms we see included in a trust's charter is what we call the spendthrift clause. A spendthrift clause forbids the assets in a trust from being pledged as collateral for other forms of debt, which could otherwise allow a beneficiary to simply sidestep the limits on the amount of cash that's available to them in any given year simply by borrowing against these other assets. Similarly, some trusts even have what is called an escape clause, where effectively they are required to think about what sorts of domicile is most appropriate for their beneficiary. Some of these clauses actually suggest that if a state changes its laws regarding disclosure of trust's beneficiaries, that the trust is required to seek a new domicile in order to protect the anonymity of its beneficiaries. So there certainly are some interesting issues related to trusts. But before we delve into those, I want to divide up the idea of a trust into three different categories. The first of these is what we call a business trust. A business trust is generally a form of holding company. It's an organization that ultimately disperses all of its earnings to its owners. Now, this is generally used to try to hold on to multiple businesses at the same time and effectively acts as a portfolio for the owners of the business trust. But we also have charitable trusts or endowments, which are managing donated funds for the benefit of disadvantaged groups or to provide long-term support to particular causes or organizations. We see, for instance, national level endowments in the form of sovereign wealth funds, religious endowments, educational endowments. These sorts of portfolios are very similar in the sense that the founders or the people providing the assets have necessarily been separated off from the beneficiaries while the portfolio is managed by trustees for their benefit. But finally, we come to an investment trust, which is effectively a company that retains control over funds that are invested purely for the benefit of others. It's very similar to a charitable trust, except that the beneficiaries are the owners of the fund who are providing the capital. It's also very similar to a business trust in that most investment trusts purchase a number of different kinds of securities to hold in their portfolio for the benefit of their beneficiaries. Now, regardless of their specific objectives, whether we're talking about trying to coordinate multiple businesses, we're hoping to simply make investments for the future, or we're hoping to protect some kind of institution over the vagaries of its funding cycle, the economic role of all trusts is effectively the same, which is to provide security of entrusted assets and to make allocation decisions with their yield in support of some goal. So in that sense, even though there are distinctions between the various kinds of trusts, it's worth noting that there are broad similarities between them. Now, trusts themselves got a pretty bad name in the late 1800s when several American industrialists decided to try to sidestep laws that were originally put in place to limit corporate size. And the way they did this was by establishing trusts that would allow them to coordinate several freestanding firms at the same time. Organizationally, what happened is that owners provided shares of their own companies to the trust in exchange for shares in the trust itself. And this allowed for business combinations to effectively take place outside of the rules of particular states, which had limited or attempted to limit corporate size by blocking certain kinds of mergers. And this ultimately was very beneficial for the firms in question, unsurprisingly, as they built up a cartel, but it wasn't necessarily beneficial to other people who were competing in this particular market space. And so Standard Oil, perhaps the most famous of all of the 19th century business trusts, actually exemplifies this situation rather well, as we see the firm stepping outside of the legal restrictions imposed on it by the various states in which it operates. For instance, in 1892, Standard Oil of Ohio was ordered to dissolve its operations, simply because there had been a breach in state laws which was registered in Ohio from conducting these kinds of interstate operations. And so because Standard Oil had purchased Ohio-based companies, they found themselves in violation of this law, and the state attempted to dismantle the entire trust. As a response, Standard Oil simply spun off Standard Oil of Ohio, which would only operate within that state, while effectively maintaining control of it through the Standard Oil Trust. Now, after almost 2 decades of dancing around one another, the federal government finally stepped in and ordered Standard Oil's dissolution in 1911 using a series of legislation called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And they did this largely because of unfair practices, abuse of the control of pipelines, railroad discrimination, and unfair methods of competition, even though it could very easily be argued that Standard Oil had rationalized the industry, to steal a phrase from the time period, and had driven down prices for consumers. They had also made it impossible for other firms to break into that particular industry and compete with them. And as a result, the federal government broke the company into 34 separate components and forced them to compete with each other to the extent possible. Now, considering the trust model even further, we have also the notion that we could build a portfolio of different kinds of businesses, and not just for the purpose of attaining a higher Sharpe ratio and passively diversifying across a number of firms. Instead, the notion is that we could control the swing of various industries by focusing investment capital into specific areas, which would provide significant political as well as economic power. And this was a problem that emerged once again in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the United States. Much of the industrialization of the United States in the 1800s took place with the capital of foreign investors, in particular British investors. But as they'd been burned by a series of financial crises throughout the 19th century, they eventually came to only want to invest in equities, provided they had effectively a local comprador who could help them to navigate the difficulties of various kinds of local tycoons, local government regulations, and local opportunities. For British investors, their favorite intermediary in this particular trade was American banker J.P. Morgan. He was instrumental in putting together such large monopolies as U.S. Steel, Northern Securities Trust, and others in an attempt to reduce inefficiency among corporate firms, or among firms in a sort of process that has been termed Morganization. Morganization was ultimately about trying to limit inefficient competition that was reducing corporate profits, effectively a throwback to the kinds of monopoly enterprises that we see in 17th century Britain, such that the firms are no longer losing or wasting resources in an effort to differentiate their products or driving down profits for investors through price-based competition. Now, while this might be better for producers from an economic perspective, one can imagine that having monopolies or oligopolies generally can lead to higher consumer prices. And even though certain organizations like Standard Oil had pushed down prices for consumers, they did so at the expense of any potential competitors. And this was the major concern about the waves of monopolies that were beginning to appear in what was termed the Gilded Age in the United States. Ultimately, the Pujo Committee in 1912 and 13 found that Morgan and a small cadre of bankers, which controlled a total of 18 institutions, held 341 board seats across 122 companies that controlled at the time roughly $22 billion worth of assets, which was approximately half of the US GDP of 45 billion at the time. Equivalent in today's number, we'd be looking at a small group of bankers indirectly controlling $11 trillion worth of assets today. Now, while the J.P. Morgan's money trust wasn't officially broken up, what was done is a passage of a series of laws between 1913 and 14 in the United States, which were ultimately designed to limit the scale of these kinds of large coordinated pools of capital and to try to reduce the kinds of undue influence that the Pujo Committee felt was beginning to accrue to the money trust of New York. And these included establishing things like the Federal Reserve Act that helped to create a decentralized national banking system. We also see the Federal Trade Commission Act appearing in 1914 to help further investigate antitrust violations. And finally, the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914 to help regulate interlocking directorates and what the consequences of these might be in terms of conflicts of interest between firms. So needless to say, trusts have been fairly important in financial history, especially as some of the problems with them, which got out of hand roughly 100, 120 years ago, have helped to provide us with a modern framework for controlling and trying to limit the influence of these fairly important structures within our society.